Throughout its investigation, the committee has carefully inquired into the role of presidents and their advisors with respect to particular intelligence programs. On occasion, intelligence agencies concealed their programs from those in higher authority. More frequently, it was the senior officials themselves who, through pressure for results, created the climate within which the abuses occurred. It is clear that greater executive control and accountability is necessary. The legislative branch has been remiss in exercising its control over the intelligence agencies. For 25 years, Congress has appropriated funds for intelligence activities. The closeted and fragmentary accounting which the intelligence community has given to a designated small group of legislators was accepted by the Congress as adequate and in the best interest of national security. There were occasions when the executive intentionally withheld information relating to intelligence programs from the Congress, but there were also occasions when the principal role of Congress was to call for more intelligence activity, including activity which infringed the rights of citizens. In general, as with the executive, it is clear that Congress did not carry out effective oversight. The courts have also not confronted intelligence issues. As the Supreme Court noted in 1972 in commenting on warrantless electronic surveillance, the practice had been permitted by successive presidents for more than a quarter of a century without, quote, guidance from the Congress or a definitive decision of the courts, end quote. Of course, courts only consider the issues brought before them by litigants, and pervasive secrecy, coupled with tight judicially imposed rules of standing, have contributed to the absence of judicial decisions on intelligence issues. Nevertheless, the committee's investigation has uncovered a host of serious legal and constitutional issues relating to intelligence activity, and it is strong proof of the need for reform to note that scarcely any of those issues have been addressed in the courts. Throughout the period, the general public, while generally excluded from debate on intelligence issues, nevertheless supported the known and perceived activities of the intelligence activities. In the few years prior to the establishment of this committee, however, the public's awareness of the need to examine intelligence issues was heightened. The series of allegations and partial exposures in the press and the Congress provoked serious questions about the conduct of intelligence activities at home and abroad. The Watergate affair increased the public's concern about abuse of governmental power and caused greater attention to be paid to the need to follow and to strengthen the role of law to check such abuses. Against this background, the committee considered its main task as making informed recommendations and judgments on the extent to which intelligence activities are necessary and how such necessary activities can be conducted within the framework of the Constitution. Section E. The dilemma of secrecy and open constitutional government. Since World War II, with steady escalating consequences, many decisions of national importance have been made in secrecy, often by the executive branch alone. These decisions are frequently based on end of page 19, beginning of page 20. Information obtained by clandestine means and available only to the executive branch. Until very recently, the Congress has not shared in this progress. The cautions expressed by the Founding Fathers and the constitutional checks designed to ensure that policy making not become the province of one man or a few men have been avoided on notable recent occasions through the use of secrecy. John Adams expressed his concern about the dangers of arbitrary power 200 years ago. Whenever we leave principles and clear positive laws, we are soon lost in the wild regions of imagination and possibility, where arbitrary power sits upon her brazen throne and governs with an iron scepter. Recent presidents have justified this secrecy on the basis of, quote, national security, end quote, the requirements of national defense, end quote, or, end quote, the confidentiality required by sensitive ongoing negotiations or operations, quote. These justifications were generally accepted at face value. The Bay of Pigs fiasco, the secret war in Laos, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the anti-Allende activities in Chile, the Watergate affair were all instances of the use of power cloaked in secrecy, which, when revealed, provoked widespread popular disapproval. This series of events has ended, for the time being at least, passive and uncritical acceptance by the Congress of executive decisions in the areas of foreign policy, national security, and intelligence activities. If Congress had met its oversight responsibilities, some of these activities might have been averted. An examination of the scope of secret intelligence activities undertaken in the past 3 decades reveals that they ranged from war to conventional espionage. It appears that some United States intelligence activities may have violated treaty and covenant obligations, but more importantly, the rights of United States citizens have been infringed upon. Despite citizen and congressional concern about these programs, no processes or procedures have been developed by either the Congress or the executive branch which would ensure Congress of access to secret information, which it must have to carry out its constitutional responsibilities in authorizing and giving its advice and consent. The hindsight of history suggests that many secret operations were ill-advised or might have been more beneficial to United States interests had they been conducted openly rather than secretly. What is a valid national secret? What can be properly concealed from the scrutiny of the American people, from various segments of the executive branch, or from a duly constituted oversight body of their elected representatives? Assassination plots? The overthrow of an elected democratic government? Drug testing on unwitting American citizens? Obtaining millions of private cables? Massive domestic spying by the CIA and the military? The illegal opening of mail? Attempts by an agency of the government to blackmail a civil rights leader? These have occurred, and each has been withheld from scrutiny by the public and the Congress by the label, quote, secret intelligence, end quote. In the committee's view, these illegal, improper, or unwise acts are not valid national secrets, and most certainly should not have been kept from the scrutiny of a duly constituted congressional oversight body. The definition of a valid national secret is far more difficult to set forth. It varies from time to time. There is presently a general agree. End of page 20, beginning of page 21. Meant that details about military activities, technology, source of information, and particular intelligence methods are secrets that should be carefully protected. It is most important that a process be devised for agreeing on what national secrets are, so that the reasons for necessary secrecy are understood by all 3 branches of government and the public, that they be under constant review and that any changes requiring the protection of new types of information can be addressed, understood, and agreed on within a framework of constitutional consensus. The committee stresses that these questions remain to be decided by the Congress and executive jointly. What should be regarded as a national secret? Who determines what is to be kept secret? How can decisions made in secret or programs secretly approved be reviewed? Two great problems have confronted the committee in carrying out its charge to address these issues. The first is how our open democratic society, which has endured and flourished for 200 years, can be adapted to overcome the threats to liberty posed by the continuation of secret government activities. The leaders of the United States must devise ways to meet their respective intelligence responsibilities, including informed and effective congressional oversight, in a manner which brings secrecy and the power that secrecy affords within constitutional bounds. For the executive branch, the specific problem concerns instituting effective control and accountability systems and improving efficiency. Many aspects of these two problem areas, which have been examined during the committee's inquiry of intelligence agencies, are addressed in the recommendations in Chapter 18. It is our hope that intelligence oversight committees working with the executive branch will develop legislation to remedy the problems exposed by our inquiry and described in this report. The committee has already recommended the creation of an oversight committee with the necessary powers to exercise legislative authority over the intelligence activities of the United States. It is clear that the Congress must exert its will and devise procedures that will enable it to play its full constitutional role in making policy decisions concerning intelligence activities. Failure to do so would permit further erosion of the constitutional government. This committee has endeavored to include in its final public report enough information to validate its findings and recommendations. Most of the inquiry and documentation obtained by the committee, particularly that concerning foreign and military intelligence, is of a highly classified nature. Determining what could and should be revealed has been a major concern. In a meeting with President Ford at the outset of our inquiry in February 1975, the committee agreed not to disclose any classified information provided by the executive branch without first consulting the appropriate agencies, offices, and departments. In the case of objections, the committee agreed to carefully consider the executive's reasons for maintaining secrecy, but the committee determined that final decisions on any disclosure would be up to the committee. End of page 21, beginning of page 22. The Select Committee has scrupulously adhered to this agreement. The interim report on alleged assassination plots involving foreign leaders, the report on CIA activities in Chile, and report on illegal NSA surveillances and the disclosure of illegal activities on the part of FBI COINTELPRO, the FBI's harassment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and other matters revealed in the committee's public hearings were all carefully considered by the committee and the executive branch working together to determine what information could be declassified and revealed without damaging national security. In those reports and hearings, virtually all differences between between the committee and the executive were resolved. The only significant exception concerned the release to the public of the assassination report, which the executive branch believed would harm national security. The committee decided otherwise. Some criteria for defining a valid national secret have been agreed to over the past year. Both the committee and the executive branch now agree that generally the names of intelligence sources and the details of sensitive methods used by the intelligence services should remain secret whenever possible. The right of privacy of individuals and groups should also be preserved. It was agreed, however, that the details of illegal acts should be disclosed and that the broad scope of United States intelligence activities should be sufficiently described to give public reassurance that the intelligence agencies are operating consistent with the law and declared national policy. The declassification working procedures developed between this committee, the CIA, and other parts of the intelligence community constitute the beginnings of agreed, sound, and sensible methods and criteria for making public matters that should be made public. This disclosure process is an important step toward achieving a national consensus required if our intelligence system is to enjoy essential public support. There is a clear necessity after 30 years of substantial secret activities for public debate and legislative decisions about the future course of our intelligence system. This report is intended to assist the Senate, the Congress, and the country in making the vital decisions that are required to be made in the coming years. This section of the final report focuses on the departments and agencies engaged in foreign and military intelligence. The committee's findings, conclusions, and recommendations in these areas can be found in Chapter 18. End of page 22. The beginning of page 23. One moment. Two, the foreign and military intelligence operations of the United States. An overview. Permanent institutions for the conduct of secret foreign and military intelligence activities are a relatively new feature of American government. Secured behind two oceans and preoccupied with the settlement of a continent, America has no permanent foreign intelligence establishment for more than a century and a half. In times of crisis, Americans improvised their intelligence operations. In times of peace, such operations were not needed and were allowed to lie fallow. Despite the experience of the First World War, Americans believed they could continue this pattern well into the 20th century. The military services developed important technical intelligence capabilities, such as the breaking of the Japanese Code, but the American public remained unaware of the importance of effective intelligence for its security. As a world power, the United States came late into intelligence. It came on December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That searing intelligence failure led to the Congress' first effort to deal with the necessity and complexity of modern intelligence. The Joint Committee on the Pearl Harbor attack, after a sweeping investigation, recommended in 1946 a unified and permanent intelligence effort by the United States, concepts ultimately embodied in the Basic Charter for American Intelligence. The National Security Act, adopted by the Congress in 1947. However, neither the Pearl Harbor Committee nor the National Security Act addressed some of the fundamental problems secret intelligence operations posed for our democracy and constitutional form of government and America's unique system of checks and balances. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Activities represents the second major effort by the Congress to come to grips with intelligence problems. In particular, the basic constitutional and structural issues arising from a permanent secret intelligence establishment. While these problems were the subject of the investigation and are the focus of this report, the Select Committee wishes to emphasize that it found much that was good and proper in the American intelligence effort. In particular, the capacity and dedication of men and women serving in our intelligence services is to be commended. This inquiry was not brought forth by an individual event such as a massive intelligence failure threatening the nation's security. Rather, it is the result of series of occurrences adversely affecting the liberties of individual Americans under the long-term interests and reputation of the United States. In effect, the Select Committee was created to deal with the question of whether our democratic system has effectively governed in the crucial areas of secret intelligence. End of page 23, beginning of page 24. Mr. Clark Clifford, one of the authors of the National Security Act of 1947, told the committee that the law that was drawn in 1947 was of a general nature, and properly so, because it was the first law of its kind. We were blazing a new trail. Footnote 1. Footnote 1 says, Clark Clifford Testimony, December 5th, 75, Hearings, Volume 7, page 50. Resuming the reading. It has been the responsibility of the Select Committee to consider where this secret trail has taken the nation, and with this as prologue to begin the task of charting the future. A. The basic issues, secrecy and democracy. The task of democratic government is to reconcile conflicting values. The fundamental question faced by the Select Committee is how to reconcile the clash between secrecy and democratic government itself. Secrecy is an essential part of most intelligence activities. However, secrecy undermines the United States government's capacity to deal effectively with the principal issues of American intelligence addressed by the Select Committee. The lack of clear legislation defining the authority for permissible intelligence activities has been justified in part for reasons of secrecy. Absent clear legal boundaries for intelligence activities, the Constitution has been violated in secret and the power of the executive branch has gone unchecked, unbalanced. Secrecy has shielded intelligence activities from full accountability and effective supervision both within the executive branch and by the Congress. Reliance on covert action has been excessive because it offers a secret shortcut around democratic process. This shortcut has led to questionable foreign involvements and unacceptable acts. The important line between public and private action has become blurred as the result of the secret use of private institutions and individuals by intelligence agencies. This clandestine relationship has called into question their integrity and undermined the crucial independent role of the private sector in the American system of democracy. Duplication, waste, inertia, and ineffectiveness in the intelligence community has been one of the costs of insulating the intelligence bureaucracy from the rigors of congressional and public scrutiny. Finally, secrecy has been a tragic conceit. Inevitably, the truth prevails and policies pursued on the premise that they could be plausibly denied, in the end damage America's reputation and the faith of her people in their government. For 3 decades, these problems have grown more intense. The United States government responded to the challenge of secret intelligence operations by resorting to procedures that were informal, implicit, tacit. Such an approach could fit within the tolerances of our democratic system so long as such activities were small or temporary. Now, however, the permanence and scales of America's intelligence effort and the persistence of its problems requires a different solution. End of page 24, beginning of page 25. B. The scope of the Select Committee's inquiry into foreign and military intelligence operations. The operations of the United States government in the field of intelligence involve the activities of hundreds of thousands of individuals and the expenditure of billions of dollars. They are carried out by a complex, quote, community, end quote, of organizations whose functions interact and overlap. Because of their scope, the Select Committee could not deal in depth with all aspects of America's intelligence activities. Instead, the committee focused on the principal organizations, their key functions, and major issues confronting the United States in the field of foreign and military intelligence. In doing so, the committee sought to uncover the truth of alleged abuses by the intelligence agencies and to ascertain the legitimate needs and requirements of an effective future intelligence system for the United States that can function with the boundaries established by the Constitution and our democratic form of government. The Select Committee focused on 5 institutions. The National Security Council, NSC, which on behalf of the President is supposed to direct the entire national security apparatus of the United States government, including the intelligence community. As the senior policy making in the executive branch in the field of national security, the NSC is also the ultimate consumer of the nation's intelligence product. The Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, who is charged with producing intelligence which reflects the judgment of all in intelligence organizations in the executive branch. He is supposed to, quote, coordinate, end quote, the activities of these organizations. The Central Intelligence Agency, which houses the government's central analytical staff for the production of intelligence, but which devotes its major efforts to developing new means of technical collection and to operating America's clandestine intelligence services throughout the world. In the latter capacity, it carries out covert action, paramilitary operations, and espionage. The Department of State, which is the primary source of intelligence on foreign political and economic matters, and as such is both a competitor in the collection and evaluation of intelligence and a potential source of external control over clandestine activities of the Central Intelligence Agency. The Department of Defense, which is a major collection of intelligence, the largest consumer as well as the principal manager of the resources devoted to intelligence. It houses the largest intelligence collection organization, the National Security Agency, NSA, and the largest intelligence analysis organization, the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA. C. The intelligence process, theory and reality. These organizations and some of their offshoots constitute the United States intelligence community. In theory, at least their operations can be described in simple terms by the following cycle. End of page 25, beginning of page 26. Those who use intelligence, the, quote, consumers, end quote, indicate the kind of information needed. These needs are translated into concrete, quote, requirements, end quote, by senior intelligence managers. The requirements are used to allocate resources to the, quote, collectors, end quote, and serve to guide their efforts. The collectors obtain the required information, or, quote, raw intelligence, end quote. The, quote, raw intelligence, end quote, is collated and turned into, quote, finished intelligence, end quote, by the, quote, analysts, end quote. The finished intelligence is distributed to the consumer and the intelligence managers, who state new needs, define new requirements, and make necessary adjustments in the intelligence programs to improve effectiveness and efficiency. In reality, this pattern is barely recognizable. There are many different consumers, from the president to the weapons designer. Their needs can conflict. Consumers rarely take the time to define their intelligence needs, and even if they do so, there is no effective and systematic mechanism for translating them into intelligence requirements. Therefore, intelligence requirements reflects what intelligence managers think the consumers need, and equally important, what they think their organizations can produce. Since there are many managers and little central control, each is relatively free to set his own requirements. Resources therefore tend to be allocated according to the priorities and concerns of the various intelligence bureaucracies. Most intelligence collection operations are part of other organizations, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and so their requirements and their consumers are often the first to be served. Collecting intelligence is not an automatic process. There are many different kinds of intelligence, from a radar return to an indiscreet remark, and the problems in acquiring it vary greatly. Information that is wanted may not be available, or years may be required to develop an agency or a technical device to get it. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies collect what they can. In the world of bureaucracy, budgets, programs, procurement, and managers, the need of the analysts can be lost in the shuffle. There has been an explosion in the volume and quality of raw intelligence, but no equivalent increase in the capacity of analytical capabilities. As a result, quote, raw, end quote, intelligence increasingly dominates, quote, finished, end quote, intelligence. Analysts find themselves on a treadmill where it is difficult to do more than summarize and put in context the intelligence flowing in. There is little time or reward for the task of providing insight. In the end, the consumer, particularly at the highest levels of the government, finds that his most important questions are not only unanswered, but sometimes not even addressed. To some extent, all this is in the nature of things. Many questions cannot be answered. The world of intelligence is dominated by uncertainty and chance. Those in the intelligence bureaucracy also, as else. End of page 26, beginning of page 27. Where, in the government, try to defend themselves against uncertainties in ways which militate against efficient management and accountability. Beyond this is the fact that the organization of the intelligence community must operate in peace but be prepared for war. This has an enormous impact on the kind of intelligence that is sought, the way resources are allocated, and the way the intelligence community is organized and managed. Equally important, the instruments of intelligence have been forged into weapons of psychological, political, and paramilitary warfare. This has had a profound effect on the perspective and preoccupations of the leadership of the intelligence community, downgrading concerns for intelligence in relation to the effective execution of operations. These programs alone would undermine any rational scheme, but it is also important to recognize that the United States intelligence community is not the work of a single author. It has evolved from an interaction of the above internal factors and the external forces that have shaped America's history since the end of the Second World War. D. Evolution of the United States intelligence community. The evolution of the United States intelligence community since World War II is part of the larger history of America's effort to come to grips with the spread of communism and the growing power of the Soviet Union. As the war ended, Americans were torn by hopes for peace and fear for the future. The determination to return the nation promptly to normal was reflected in demobilization of our wartime military establishment. In the field of intelligence, it was clear in President Truman's decision to dismantle the Office of Strategic Services, scattering its functions to the military departments and the Department of State. The Second World War saw the defeat of one brand of totalitarianism. A new totalitarian challenge quickly arose. The Soviet Union, a major ally in war, became America's principal adversary in peace. The power of fascism was in ruin, but the power of communism was mobilized. Not only had the communist parties in France, Italy, and Greece emerged politically, strengthened by their roles in the resistance, but the armies of the Soviet Union stretched across the center of Europe, and within 4 years, America's nuclear monopoly would end. American military intelligence officers were among the first to perceive the changed situation. Almost immediately after the fall of Berlin to the Red Army, United States military intelligence sought to determine Soviet objectives. Harry Rositsky, later to become chief of the CIA's Soviet division, but at the time a military intelligence officer, was dispatched to Berlin by jeep. Although the Soviet Union was still an ally, Rositsky was detained, interrogated, then ordered expelled by the Soviet occupying forces. He managed, however, to escape his Soviet escort and arrive in Berlin. He described his experiences to the committee. We got on the outskirts of Berlin and yelled out, quote, Amerikanski, end quote, and were highly welcomed. And as we went over the Autobahn, the first basic impression I got since I had known, end of page 27, beginning of page 28, Germany, well before the war, was a long walking group of German males under 16 and over 60 who were being shepherded to the east by 4'10", 5-foot Mongolian soldiers with straw shoes. The Russians also had been looting. With horses and farm wagons, they were taking away mattresses, wall fixtures, plumbing fixtures, anything other than the frame of the houses. We then made our way through the rubble of Berlin. Most were one-way streets, identifying every shoulder patch we could, and past the Siemens Halski works, in front of which were 40 or 50 Lend-Lease trucks, on each of which was a large shiny lathe, drill press, etc. When we had seen enough and were all three extremely nervous, we headed straight west from Berlin to the British zone. When we arrived, we had an enormous amount of exuberance and a real sense of relief, for the entire 36 hours had put us in another world. The words that came to my mind then were, quote, Russia moves west, end quote. Footnote 3. I'll pause the reading and read footnote 3. Harry Rositsky, testimony, October 31st, 75, page 7. Resuming reading. At home, the Truman administration was preoccupied by the transition from war to uncertain peace. Though dispersed and in some cases disbanded, America's potential capabilities in the field of intelligence were considerable. There were a large number of well-trained former OSS operation officers. The military had developed a remarkable capacity for cryptologic intelligence, the breaking of codes, and communications intelligence, COMINT. There was also a cadre of former OSS intelligence analysts, both within the government and within the academic community. E. The origins of post-war intelligence community. Footnote 4. For an organizational history of the CIA, see Chapter 6. With the experiences of World War II, and particularly Pearl Harbor, still valid, there was a recognition within the government that, notwithstanding demobilization, it was essential to create a centralized body to collate and coordinate intelligence information. There was also a need to eliminate frictions between competing military intelligences. Although there was disagreement about the structure and authority of the post-war intelligence service, President Truman and his senior advisors concluded that, unlike the OSS, this centralized body should be civilian in character. The military resisted this judgment. Virtually all of America's competing intelligence assets were in the armed forces. Then, as now, the military considered an intelligence capability essential in wartime and equally important in time of peace to be prepared for military crises. Thus, the services were strongly opposed to having their authority over intelligence diminished. In contrast, factions within the State Department were reluctant to accept any greater responsibility or role in the field of clandestine intelligence. 6 months after VJ Day, and 3 months after he had disbanded OSS, President Truman established the Central Intelligence, end of page 28, beginning of page 29, Group, CIG. CIG was the direct predecessor of the CIA. It reported to the National Intelligence Authority, a body consisting of the Secretary of State, War and Navy, and their representatives. CIG had a brief existence. It never was able to overcome the constraints and constitutional resistances found in the Department of State and the Armed Services. The National Security Act of 1947, footnote 5, was passed on July 26, 1947. Footnote 5. See Chapter 7 for an analysis of the 1947 Act. Resuming the reading. The Act included, in large part, the recommendations of a report prepared for Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal by New York investment broker Ferdinand Eberstadt. Though largely concerned with the creation of the National Security Council, NSC, and the unification of military services within the Department of State, the Act also created a Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, and a Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The powers of the DCI and the CIA were an amalgamation of careful limits on the DCI's authority over the intelligence community, and an open-ended mission for the CIA itself. The power of the DCI over military and diplomatic intelligence was confined to, quote, coordination, end quote. At the same time, however, the agency was authorized to carry out unspecified, quote, services of common concern, end quote, and more importantly, could, quote, carry out such other functions and duties, end quote, as the National Security Council might direct. Nowhere in the 1947 Act was the CIA expressly empowered to collect intelligence or intervene secretly in the affairs of other nations. But the elastic phrase, quote, such other functions, end quote, was used by successive presidents to move the agency into espionage, covert actions, paramilitary operations, and technical intelligence collection. Often conceived as having granted significant peacetime powers and flexibility to the CIA and NSC, the National Security Act actually legislated that authority to the President. The 1947 Act provided no explicit charter for military intelligence. The charter admission of military intelligence activities was established either by executive orders, such as the one creating the National Security Agency in 1952, or various National Security Council directives. These National Security Council intelligence directives, NSCIDS, were the principal means of establishing the roles and functions of all the various entities in the intelligence community. They composed the so-called, quote, secret charter, end quote, for the CIA. However, most of them also permitted, quote, departmental, end quote, intelligence activities, and in this way also provided the executive charter for the intelligence activities of the State Department and the Pentagon. However, the intelligence activities of the Department of Defense remained with the military rather than with the new Defense Department civilians. At the end of the war, the Joint Chief of Staff decided to continue the inter-service coordinating mechanism, the Joint Intelligence Committee, which had been created in 1942. With the 1947 Act and the establishment of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a working-level intelligence operation was created in the Joint Staff, known as Joint Intelligence Group, or J2, J-2, The structure created by the 1947 Act and ensuing NSCIDs was highly decentralized. The task of the CIA and the Director of Central, end of page 29, the beginning of page 30. Intelligence was to, quote, coordinate, end quote, the intelligence output of all the various intelligence collection programs in the military and the Department of State. The CIA and its director had little power to act itself, but the potential was there. F. The response to the Soviet threat. Immediately after its establishment, the CIA and other elements of the intelligence community responded to the external threats facing the United States. The threat of war in Europe. Following the war, there was a distinct possibility of a Soviet assault on Western Europe. Communist regimes had been established in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Czechoslovakia went communist in 1948 through a coup supported by the Russian army. There was a Russian-backed civil war in Greece, and above all, there was the presence of the Soviet army in Eastern Europe and the pressure on Berlin. In light of these developments, U.S. policymakers came to the conclusion that outright war with the Soviet Union was possible. The U.S. intelligence community responded accordingly. The CIA assumed the espionage task, running agents and organizing, quote, stay-behind networks, end quote, in the event the Soviets rolled west. Agents, mostly refugees, were sent into the east to report on Soviet forces and, in particular, any moves that signaled war. The U.S. went so far as to establish contact with the Ukrainian guerrillas, a relationship that was maintained until the guerrillas were finally wiped out in the early 1950s by Soviet security forces. CIA activities, however, were outnumbered by the clandestine collection operations of the military, particularly in Western Europe, where the Army maintained a large covert intelligence and paramilitary capability. Turmoil in the West. The Soviets had powerful political resources in the West. The communist parties and trade unions provided with financial and advisory support from the Soviet Union. The communist parties sought to exploit and exacerbate the economic and political turmoil in post-war Europe. As the elections in 1948 and 1949 in Italy and France approached, the democratic parties were in disarray, and the possibility of a communist takeover was real. Coordinated communist political unrest in Western countries, combined with extremist pressure from the Soviet Union, confirmed the fears of many that America faced an expansionist communist monolith. The United States responded with overt economic aid, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and covert political assistance. This latter task was assigned to the Office of Special Projects, later renamed the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC. The office was housed in the CIA, but was directly responsible to the Departments of State and Defense. Clandestine support from the United States for European democratic parties was regarded as an essential response to the threat of, quote, international communism, end quote. OPC became the fastest growing element in the CIA to facilitate its operations, as well as to finance CIA espionage activities. The Congress passed the Central Intelligence Activity Act of 1949, which authorized the director of CIA to spend funds on his voucher without having to account for disbursements. End of page 30, beginning of page 31. Nuclear weapons. The advent of nuclear weapons and the Soviet potential in this field led to efforts to ascertain the status of Soviet Union's nuclear program. By the time of the Soviets' first atomic explosion in 1949, the U.S. Air Force and Navy begun a peripheral reconnaissance program to monitor other aspects of Soviet nuclear development and Soviet military capabilities. As the Soviet strategic nuclear threat grew, America's efforts to contain it would grow in scale and sophistication until it would overshadow the classic tools of espionage. G. Korea, the turning point. The communist attack, feared in Europe, took place in Asia. The Korean War, following less than a year after the fall of China to the communists, marked a turning point for the CIA. The requirements of that war, in the involvement of China, the concern that war in Europe might soon follow, led to a fourfold expansion of the CIA, particularly in the paramilitary field. This period was characterized by efforts to infiltrate agents into mainland China, which led to the shoot down and capture of a number of Americans. The CIA's activities elsewhere in Asia also expanded. Instrumental in helping Ramon Magsaysay defeat the communists. Huk Balahaps in the Philippines. The CIA also assisted the French in their losing struggle against the Viet Minh in Indochina. The failure to anticipate the attack on Korea was regarded as a major intelligence failure. The new director of the CIA, General Bedell Smith, was determined to improve CIA's estimating and forecasting capabilities. He called on William Langer, formerly a chief of the Research and Analysis section of the OSS, to come to Washington from Harvard in 1950 to head a small staff for analysts and production of intelligence. An Office of National Estimates, ONE, was established to produce finished intelligence estimates. ONE drew on the intelligence information resources of the entire U.S. intelligence community and was aided by a board of national estimates composed of leading statesmen and academic experts. By the end of the Korean War and the naming of Allen Dulles as DCI, the powers, responsibilities, and basic structure of the CIA were established. The agency had assumed full responsibility for covert operations in 1950, and by 1952, covert action had exceeded the money and manpower allotted to the task of espionage, a situation that would persist until the early 1970s. Paramilitary actions were in disrepute because of a number of failures during the Korean War. However, the techniques of covert military assistance in training had been developed, and the pattern of CIA direction of special forces and other unconventional components of the U.S. Armed Forces in clandestine operations had been established. In the field of espionage, the CIA had become the predominant, but by no means the exclusive operator. Clandestine human collection of intelligence by the military services continued at a relatively high rate. The military also had a large stake in clandestine technical collection of intelligence. End of page 31. Beginning of page 32. I will stop here for today's recording.